On November 3rd in the year 1903, Panama declared independence from Colombia. With the support of the U.S. government, Panama issues a declaration of independence from Colombia. The revolution was engineered by a Panamanian faction backed by the Panama Canal Company, a French-U.S. corporation that hoped to connect the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans with a waterway across the Isthmus of Panama. In 1903, the Hay-Haran Treaty was signed with Colombia, granting the United States use of the Isthmus of Panama in exchange for financial compensation. The U.S. Senate ratified the treaty, but the Colombian Senate, fearing a loss of sovereignty, refused. In response, President Theodore Roosevelt, our nation's 26th president, gave tacit approval to a rebellion by Panamanian nationalists, which began on November 3rd in 1903. To aid the rebels, the U.S.-administered railroad in Panama removed its train from the northern terminus of Colon, thus stranding Colombian troops sent to crush the insurrection. Other Colombian forces were discouraged from marching on Panama by the arrival of the U.S. warship Nashville. On November 6th, the United States recognized the Republic of Panama, and on November 18th, the Hay-Buena-Varilla Treaty was signed with Panama, granting the United States exclusive and permanent possession of the Panama Canal Zone. In exchange, Panama received $10 million and an annuity of $250,000 beginning 9 years later. The treaty was negotiated by U.S. Secretary of State John Hay and the owner of the Panama Canal Company. Almost immediately, the treaty was condemned by many Panamanians as an infringement on their country's new national sovereignty. On August 15th in 1914, the Panama Canal was inaugurated with the passage of the U.S. vessel Ancon, a cargo and passenger ship. After decades of protests and negotiations, the Panama Canal passed to Panamanian control in December of 1999. On November 3rd in 1964, residents of the District of Columbia cast their ballots in a presidential election for the first time. The passage of the 23rd Amendment in 1961 gave citizens of the nation's capital the right to vote for a commander-in-chief and vice president. They went on to help Democrat Lyndon Johnson defeat Republican Barry Goldwater in 1964, the next presidential election. In 1776 and 1800, New York and then Philadelphia served as the temporary center of government for the newly formed United States. The capital's location was a source of much controversy and debate, especially for Southern politicians who didn't want it located too far north. In 1790, Congress passed a law allowing President George Washington to choose the permanent site. As a compromise, he selected a tract of undeveloped swampland on the Potomac River between Maryland and Virginia and began to refer to it as Federal City. The commissioners overseeing the development of the new city picked its permanent name, Washington, to honor the president. Congress met for the first time in Washington, D.C. on November 17th in 1800. The district was put under the jurisdiction of Congress, which terminated D.C. residents' voting rights in 1801. In 1961, the 23rd Amendment restored these rights, allowing D.C. voters to choose electors for the Electoral College based on population, with a maximum of as many electors as the least populated state. With a current population of over 550,000 residents, 61 square mile D.C. has 3 electoral votes, just like Wyoming, America's smallest state, population-wise. The majority of D.C.'s residents are African Americans, and they have voted overwhelmingly for Democratic candidates in the past presidential elections. In 1970, Congress gave Washington, D.C. one non-voting delegate to the House of Representatives, and with the passage of 1973's Home Rule Act, Washingtonians got their first elected mayor and city council. In 1978, a proposed amendment would have given D.C. the right to select electors, representatives, and senators, just like a state, but it failed to pass, as have subsequent calls for D.C. statehood. On November 3rd in 2014, One World Trade Center officially opened in Manhattan. The new tower, along with the rest of the World Trade Center complex, replaced the Twin Towers and surrounding complex, which were destroyed by terrorist attacks on September 11th in 2001. The city and the nation reeled from the attacks, which set into motion a series of U.S.-led military operations dubbed the War on Terror. It was decided that the Twin Towers should be replaced by new office buildings, parks, a museum, and a memorial to those who continued their eternity. In 2002, after cleanup and recovery efforts had concluded, the Lower Manhattan Development Corporation announced a competition to find the chief architect of the new structure. Daniel Libeskind, a Polish-American architect, then in charge of a studio in Berlin, won and became the site's master planner. In reality, however, a number of people and entities, including then Governor George Pataki, leaseholder Larry Silverstein, and Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, wrestled over what would happen to the space commonly referred to as Ground Zero. The initial plans for the site were steeped in post-9/11 patriotic sentiment. Libeskind designed an asymmetrical tower that evoked the Statue of Liberty and stood at the same height as the original World Trade Center, topped with a spire rising to 1,776 feet. Pataki dubbed it the Freedom Tower, a name which became commonplace but had largely faded from use by the time One World Trade Center opened. In 2004, Silverstein's preferred architect, David Childs, officially took over with Libeskind, staying on as the planner of the site. Child's final design, a symmetrical and more traditional tower that tapers into an octagon at its midway point and then back into a rectangular prism, was unveiled in 2005. The New York Police Department requested further alterations, most notably a windowless solid concrete base. Meant to protect against truck bombs and other potential attacks, the base was criticized as a grotesque attempt to hide the building's underlying paranoia by New York Times architecture critic Nikolai Arusov. Did I say that right? Arusov? We'll see. Its cornerstone was laid in 2004. Construction on One World Trade did not begin until the summer of 2006. The slow pace of construction, the tower topped off in August 2012 and the spire was not installed until May 2013, was a frequent source of consternation for the building's developers and the city. At the time, it allowed space for the tower to become more than a reminder of what had been lost. As architecture critic Kurt Anderson put it, the fact that it's taken more than a decade to finish, I think the gradualism makes the sense of emblematic rebirth more acute and irresistible. Prior to the opening, media conglomerate Condé Nast announced that it would move its New York headquarters from Times Square to One World Trade Center, occupying floors 20 through 44. Its location and the legacy of the original World Trade Center made the tower a natural choice for many financial institutions. But the building's developers made an effort to bring in a diverse group of tenants, including media and tech companies. Known for its floor-to-ceiling 360-degree views of Manhattan, Long Island, New Jersey, and New York Harbor, One World Trade is now one of the most notable features in the Manhattan skyline, a tribute to the buildings that preceded it, but a 21st century New York phenomenon in its own right. The information documented and divulged on this audio file
can be verified on history.com.